You are listening to Proof Text, a Glossa House podcast exploring Scripture and all things related to it. New episodes are released daily. For more information, check out glossahouse.com and subscribe to our channels on Spotify and YouTube. Welcome and enjoy.
Shalom, and welcome to this week's episode of SLA Insights. My name is Dr. Jennifer Noonan, and we're continuing to explore language acquisition and especially how it applies to ancient languages. I'm continuing a series on output and how that contributes to language acquisition, how it fits into that process. In previous episodes, I've talked about the mental processes that are involved in producing output. Last week, in the last episode, I talked about the output hypothesis and how input may be essential for acquisition, but it's not sufficient. And so output is one of those other things to help build fluency, to develop proficiency in your language. This episode, I'm going to overview the various ways that output can contribute to the process of acquisition. Then in upcoming episodes, I'm going to unpack these and provide examples and talk a little bit more in depth. But for today, just an overview so you get a big picture of the different ways that output contributes to language acquisition. Now, the roles of output are both direct and indirect. There's some direct roles that it can play and some indirect roles. So to start with the ways that output can directly affect and improve language acquisition, we're going to start with depth of learning. Output production can enable acquisition by engaging syntactic processing in a way that comprehension does not. So think about it this way. If you're going to read something or receive something, you can understand it at a higher level than you can produce it. It takes more work, more effort, and therefore it drives acquisition in a way that just simple input processing does not. A second way that output can contribute to acquisition directly is through improving automaticity. It facilitates language acquisition by giving learners the opportunity to use what they already know and help them develop automaticity in discourse and their linguistic knowledge. We're talking more exposures, more opportunities to work with the language, which builds up that automaticity and fluency in a way that just receiving input on its own may not. And then finally, under direct ways that output affects acquisition, we're looking at interaction. I talked early on in the series about meaning-focused language instruction and how that promotes the development, the acquisition of implicit language knowledge. I also talked about how it requires input and interaction. And if you're going to have interaction, somebody's got to produce output. If everybody's just receiving input, there's not a lot of direct interaction. And this process and the challenge of communicating promotes acquisition. Trying to understand, trying to be understood is a strong motivation for learning. And as I've said before, acquisition is a byproduct of comprehension. And so this drive to understand and be understood really promotes acquisition. So these are some ways that output promotes or enables acquisition directly. And again, in upcoming episodes, I'm going to talk about these in more detail and look at some examples of how you might do this in your classroom. Now, moving on to some indirect ways that output promotes acquisition. Indirectly, as I said before, interaction takes two people. And if you're producing output, the person listening is going to be receiving input. And so one person's output is the other person's input. And so you're providing a richer environment of input, which, as we've talked about, is essential for acquisition. It also includes what they call auto input, or giving yourself input. If you're speaking out loud, you're hearing yourself speak, which provides another layer of input. And it ends up being kind of like this song stuck in my head phenomenon. You know, the song that gets stuck there that you can't get rid of. When you're learning another language and you're going through the motions and speaking it to yourself, you're hearing it and it's repeating and reinforcing the things you're learning. And so indirectly, that form of output is going to provide you with more input to help you develop your language. Another role, indirect role, that output plays in promoting acquisition is in the form of diagnostics. Now, when we talk about the process of language acquisition, we have input and it goes into the learner's brain. And at that point, we can't track it anymore. The teacher doesn't know what's going on in the learner's brain, and often the learner doesn't know what's going on in the learner's brain as that material is analyzed, it's acquired, the brain is accommodating the new information, and so there's this kind of black box that we can't see what's going on until they produce output. And it's at the point of output that all of a sudden now we can see again what's going on. What have they learned? What do they know? How well did that accommodation process go? In that input that went in, how much is coming out? What did they actually learn in that process? And so for the student, it includes things like noticing, a heightened sense of awareness. Oh, I don't know what I thought I knew, or I really did learn. I know how to say that. Or reflection on, okay, how do you say that in Greek? If they were to see it, read it, hear it, they would recognize it and be able to comprehend. But on the back end, oh, wait, I'm not sure I know how to say it or produce it. Do I really know it that well? And then also, relatedly, a student will be testing hypotheses. If I say this, are they going to understand what I'm saying? If I say this, can I use it this way? Can I put these words in this order? And so these diagnostics are helping the student refine and understand the language in a way that's deeper and helping them know what they actually know and recognize what they actually do know. Now, it's a similar situation for the instructor who's observing the student producing language. What does he or she know? Where are the gaps? What do they know or not know? What got processed? What did not get processed? And so helping then with planning, what do I need to review? What do I need to reteach or reinforce? Or they do know it. Okay, what can we do next? What's the next step in the process? And so that output is a way of diagnosing what the learner has in fact learned or not, and how to proceed from there. This then is related to my last point in terms of indirect roles for output, in that output produces opportunities for feedback. So when a learner produces output and you can see or know what they know or don't know, if there's something incorrect in their output, that's where you can say, oh, you misunderstand. This is how we need to fix it. And there's a whole body of literature on how to provide feedback. There are things like direct feedback by saying, no, that's feminine and it needs to be masculine. There's indirect feedback where you say, oh, excuse me, could you say that again? Or I didn't understand. Or you recast it. They said, I go to the store. And you say, oh, you went to the store? In correcting it just in the flow of conversation. And so there are a number of ways of doing that. And again, in upcoming episodes, I'm going to provide more detail and talk about different ways of providing feedback to your students. So these are then some direct and the last ones were some indirect ways that output contributes to language acquisition. And as you see, output is often functioning in a refining role. It's helping to notice, what did they get? What did they not get? How do I say this? How do I bump up my level? How do I level up in terms of my language acquisition? So it does play a role, and it really is an important role in the development of language proficiency. So for next week, as I said, I'm going to start going back through these processes, these roles that output plays, and providing more depth for each of them. The next week, I'll go back to the first one and talk about depth of learning and how output promotes depth of learning and how you can do that for your own learning or for your students' learning in the classroom. I hope you can join me for that one. In the meantime, have a great week.
Interested in growing your ancient language skills but not sure where to start? Glossa House can help. From illustrated readers and short stories to lexicons and grammars, Glossa House offers a variety of resources for beginning, intermediate, and experienced ancient language learners. Head to glossahouse.com today. Glossa House, language resources for the global community.